Hello, everyone. I'm Maria Fernanda Gebara. Thanks for the opportunity of speaking in such an inspiring session. The main objective of my presentation is to highlight the need to rethink human relationships with the rest of nature and how indigenous ontologies could positively contribute to transitioning from the COVID-19 crisis. I start by questioning who is invading whom. Many have argued that the pandemic is nature's revenge, and this is because when we think about the root causes of pandemics, we see that they are mainly due to constant anthropic intervention in natural systems. So, thinking about indigenous peoples, novel pathogens have disseminated indigenous populations since colonial times. If we think that areas considered pristine in terms of natural value were in fact sustainably managed by local inhabitants over millennia, we can have a better idea of how indigenous knowledge is crucial in transitioning to more sustainable futures. Once indigenous people are immersed in deep experiences with nature, they view and live the world as relational and animate. Humans are nature and vice versa, meaning that the whole nature and universe are alive. Indigenous people have also deployed what has been called exuberant technologies of enchantment that reinforce connections with places and events, and they perceive themselves as serving this other than human contexts rather than the opposite. So, some examples from Amazonian groups on these ontologies. The Kayapo believe that their ancestors learned their social skills from insects. For the Bora, plants hold a complex and important knowledge that should be respected. The Ashaninka believe that human beings perceive only the apparent manifestations of material reality, and the Yawanawa view themselves and nature as part of an extended ecological family. What does this mean in practice? Nowadays, we have what is called anthropocentric politics, where the human subject is at the center of the juridical order as the only true agent and beneficiary. And in an ecocentric approach, human beings are perceived as an integral part of a much larger whole. But up until now, only Ecuador has rights on nature in its constitution. In Bolivia, there is a recognition of the rights of Mother Earth. It also recognizes vivir bien, which means living well and in harmony with nature. But in both countries, there are contradictions between such frameworks and the prevalent neoliberal logic of development. Unfortunately, in Brazil, there are no attempts to turn away from anthropocentric hierarchies, and although the constitution recognizes different environmental and indigenous rights, it also entrenches humans as the main beneficiaries of such rights. There are some critiques that raise different questions about the real intentions behind such a movement, but still they represent a move to turn away from anthropocentric approaches that create new ethical obligations towards the other than human world. So, thinking about the human nature dualism, we need to start questioning the place of humans at the center of world history, a view that flourished in the Enlightenment, and the assumption that the human prerogative is only reason to be able to then bring about new emphasis on diversity reflected in the notion of the multiverse or a pluralistic universe. This refers to the entanglement of several ontologies and agency distribution. And it seems to me that the indigenous wisdom could guide us towards these new possibilities and how to interact with what is strangely invisible, but certainly necessary if we want to rethink and shape our standards of behavior. But of course, there is a risk that the adoption of the beyond human nature duality and the decolonizing discourses by scholarship, private and public actors may turn such approaches into metaphors. This means that they can further colonialism in an attempt to reconcile settler guilt and complicity. It is like the settler holds a better position to understand indigenous knowledge to make the best use of it. Different than the old settler that would dominate the land directly, the new settler, to use Tuck and Young words, is making a new home rooted in a homesteading worldview where the wild land and the wild people were made for his benefit. So it is important to keep in mind that decolonization is not accountable to settler futurity. It should be accountable to indigenous sovereignty in the first place. We should also be able to better include the contributions of indigenous intellectuals and activists to theories and frameworks. There is little recognition now, given that these discussions often take place in the spaces that are restricted to non-indigenous intellectuals. And finally, accept that the answers will not come from friendly understanding and a conflicting scenario may emerge, but we should think of conflicts as constructive and not something to be avoided. So it is important to reimagine political systems in transitioning from the COVID crisis, and the concept of cosmopolitics is a good start as it includes different parts of the cosmos as beings of rights. And this is also reflected in an emergent indigeneity in governance that is happening in different parts of the world, and it's already being discussed in global arenas such as the United Nations. And we do not need to go far into the forest to find more about such ideas. There are many other examples of traditions and studies that are trying to reanimate the landscape. Paganism is a great example, and many would argue that the ecological problem actually dates back to overcoming paganism with monotheism. Panpsychism, cosmopsychism, and quantum mechanics, which affirm that everything down to the level of quantum has conscience, are other examples. And also a growing body of research on the intelligence and teachings of other than human beings, such as plants. So the point is that these are philosophical and scientific questions that are more and more reaching over modern science, and we could use this work to start tearing down the ontologies that are defended by indigenous peoples for centuries, changing the hegemonic view that all that is here to serve us. IP elders, however, are dying, and the youth are losing interest on ancient knowledge, and differently than in Western culture, there are no books in a more hopeful side of the equation. As well, there are different initiatives already happening. They are very inspiring. So going back to the question of, is it really nature's revenge? Well, if we think that bacteria, which are a type of pathogen, was the first life on Earth, maybe we would have another perception of things. We would better acknowledge the power of other beings over us and recognize that we are just traces in the history of Earth. So I don't think it's a revenge, but an opportunity to rethink our relationship with the rest of nature. To conclude, there is an urgent need for a conceptual, educational, institutional, and entrepreneurial revolution. It seems that nowadays nature is unavoidably political, and this is the main reason why it is important to ask ourselves who defines nature, for what purposes, and in whose interests. to finish with, I'm gonna leave you with these images of the flat Earth and the French Revolution as reminders that our current beliefs and what is in fashion in science may not be necessarily true. It took centuries for scientists to prove that the Earth is not flat, but it took just 3 years of revolution to change centuries of absolutism in France. So this could give us another perception of changing things. And finally, for Indigenous people, what we are going through is a necessary passage. So I hope we'll come out of it as a more mature species. Thank you very much.